Okay, all right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be here with Sophfronia Scott to talk about her newest book. I'm going to give it just a second and let everyone log on. We are thrilled to be here tonight to talk about The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton. I love the title. I love the cover. So we're excited to get to hear from Sophfronia in just a second. So we'll get started here in a minute. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. Hi.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Yeah, welcome.
You know, I actually did a call earlier today for people in the publishing house. So Broadleaf Books is part of a bigger company called 1517 Media. And this was an event, myself as an author speaking to the employee base about one of their products. And one of the things I talked about, besides writing the book, I talked about how well produced it is. I was like, you guys have to know that this is, really well done, and I love the way the cover feels. And I think people connect to the book partially also because of the feel of it, right? They love it in their hands.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it does. It feels good. It looks good. It's got like nice texture to it. So yeah, available at Midtown Reader. So you can stop by and pick it up. You can call us. You can visit midtownreader.com. We'll deliver in our cute smart car for $5 anywhere in Tallahassee, and we're happy to ship anywhere outside of Tallahassee. So, all right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening again, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Katie Hotemacki from Midtown Reader, an independent bookstore here in Tallahassee, Florida, if you're joining us from somewhere else. We're thrilled to be here tonight talking with Sophfronia Scott about her newest book, The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton, out from Broadleaf Books. Like I said, we have copies of books available at the store, so stop by and see us, and one of our booksellers can hook you up with a copy. Before I introduce Sophfronia and talk about the book, I wanted to let you know that we'll allow a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can submit that at any time during the event through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll allow some time at the end for those. I know Sophfronia would love to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's author. Sophfronia Scott is a novelist, essayist, and contemplative thinker whose work has appeared in Time, People, the Oprah magazine, and numerous other publications. When her first novel, All I Need to Get By, was published, she was nominated for Best New Author at the African American Literary Awards and hailed by Henry Louis Gates Jr. as one of the best writers of her generation. Her other books include Unforgivable Love, Love's Long Line, and This Child of Faith. Scott holds degrees from Harvard and the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She is taught at Regis University, Bay Path University, and currently serves as founding director of Alma College's MFA in Creative Writing. She grew up in Lorain, Ohio, a hometown she shares with Toni Morrison, and now lives in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. In The Seeker and the Monk, Scott mines the extensive private journals of Trappist monk, mystic, and activist Thomas Merton, one of the most influential contemplative thinkers of the past, for guidance on how to live in these fraught times. As a Black woman who is not Catholic, Scott both learns from and pushes back against Merton, holding spirited and intimate conversations on race, ambition, faith, activism, nature, prayer, friendship, and love. Together with Merton, Scott considers questions like, what if we truly belong to each other? What if we are all walking around shining like the sun? What is the connection between contemplation and action? How do we care about the brutality in the world while not being overwhelmed by it? By engaging in this lively discourse, readers will gain a steady sense of how to dwell more deeply within and to love this despairing and radiant world, as well as the creator who made and sustains it, I would add. And now I'd like to start by inviting Sophfronia to read an excerpt from The Seeker and the Monk. I believe this is an excerpt from the book that ran in the National Catholic Reporter recently. So Sophfronia, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, thank you, Katie. I'm excited to be here. I love talking to readers. This is, any book to me is like a message in a bottle. You put it in a bottle, you throw it out into the ocean, and you don't know who receives it and how they read it and what they think about it. So it's nice to be in a realm where I can find some of the people who pulled the bottle out of the ocean, so to speak. So the piece that I'm reading, yes, it is excerpted from National Catholic Reporter, and it's an excerpt from chapter 4, which is the chapter called I Am a Bird Waiting, How to Find God's Presence in Nature. Over the course of a wet and chilly weekend in December, I walked in the footsteps of Thomas Merton. I wouldn't call my trip to his corner of Kentucky a pilgrimage. I knew I would do some praying when I joined the monks in their daily cycle of chanting and prayer, but I didn't have a plan beyond that. I traveled alone, and I wasn't sure how comfortable I'd be rambling the woods by myself, but I knew I wanted to try. The grounds of the Abbey of Gethsemani cover nearly 1,500 acres of hills called knobs, valleys, lakes, fields, and forests. To know Merton's work is to know this landscape because he photographed it and wrote about it so often. From basic observations about the weather to contemplative ruminations connecting the natural world to the divine presence at work, his observant eyes and ears absorbed the vital details, and he found words to bring it all to life. Such words from his book, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, are what first captivated me as I heard out loud his descriptions of birdsong, awakening, each in their own turn. Even now, when I hear a crow, I think of how he thought, quote, the waking of crows is most like the waking of men, querulous, noisy, raw, unquote. Merton's connection with this corner of the earth, located 50 miles south of Louisville, Kentucky, is so deeply personal. It only made sense for me to venture out and, in a fashion, meet him where he once was. I pulled on my hiking boots and zipped up my coat. I studied the map on the sheet of paper I received from the lobby desk of the Abbey's guest house, and then set out down the driveway under a tin gray sky. I assumed Merton's connection to the woods around the monastery grew from his earliest days as a young novice. While there's some truth to that, Merton's direct experience of the land came much later. The property behind the Abbey's church and the monastery itself are walled-off enclosures. When Merton first arrived at Gethsemani, monks were not allowed outside the walls except for work assignments, such as clearing brush in the fields or planting trees in the woods. His days were spent in cycles of prayer, study, and writing. Even today, on the monastery's website, a note to visitors reads, "We ask you to bear in mind that the monastic life is lived as a separation from the world." Merton lived the first 8 years of his monastic life for the most part behind the Abbey's walls, and yet he found the experience less than peaceful. He chafed at having little time to himself because of his duties, and as royalties from his books flowed and the Abbey began the noisy work of renovations and the mechanization of its farming and cheesemaking activities, he found quiet hard to come by as well. He wanted solitude. He thought about leaving for a different monastic order, the Camaldolese, in which the monks live in solitude as hermits. His superiors tried to assuage his desire to leave by allowing him solitary spaces for his writing and reading. But then, unexpectedly, about a month after his ordination to the priesthood, Merton writes that on June 27th, 1949, quote, "Reverend Father gave me permission to go out of the enclosure into the woods by myself," unquote. On that day, his writing and his spirituality changed forever. This footnote appears on the page of that day's journal entry. Quote, "The expansiveness and depth of Merton's prose as he recalls his walk marks June 27th, 1949 as a day on which Merton's life at Gethsemani breaks out beyond a past mental and physical confinement," unquote. In the book Thomas Merton's Gethsemani, Landscapes of Paradise, author Monica Weiss notes of this time, once beyond the monastery walls, Merton's heart soared. I figured it would be easy enough to make it to St. Edmund's Lake, less than half a mile from the Abbey, and according to my map, pretty much a straight shot once I crossed the road, Highway 247. I could be back in less than an hour, in time for the known prayer at 2:15 p.m. The path took me through harvested fields that rolled up and away from me to my right. I wondered if these were the same fields that Merton had worked as a young man, before the Abbey had machinery to tend the farm. He had relished the exertion of harvesting corn and cutting tobacco, and he enjoyed the fellowship of his monastery brothers toiling with him under the sun. 3 or 4 grand old trees stood out in the distance, rising up from the fields with their bare branches and straight trunks. They reminded me of the tree in the field that Red, Morgan Freeman, is looking for when he seeks out Andy's gift for him at the end of the film, The Shawshank Redemption. I stepped around muddy puddles left from an earlier pouring rain. It's a known fact that going outside and being in nature is good for us. But what Merton experienced that first day of being allowed outside the walls and on the days that followed was beyond taking a hike and beyond simply stopping to smell the roses. Merton's heart didn't soar, profoundly touched, because he took a walk. He felt something out there, something I dare say so many of us seek when we are hungering for an experience of God. Quote, "As soon as I get away from people, the presence of God invades me," he writes. "And when I am not divided by being with strangers, in a sense anyone I live with will always remain a stranger, I am with Christ," unquote. Merton found somehow beneath the branches, on the sides of the hills, in all of nature, a sense of transcendence. I'm guessing that after being doused in words for so many years, suddenly he could be in this expansive, silent space with God and just listen. This was not necessarily prayer, which people usually understand to be about talking to God. This was about reaching out. This was about feeling. Within the monastery walls, it was as if he were continually fussing with the dials of an old ham radio, hoping to tune into a divine frequency. But outside, he could be the antenna, maybe even the frequency. To me, this is transcendence, which, as Thomas has helped me understand, is about an awareness, perhaps even a fine-tuning. I'm not sure there are even proper words for what I'm trying to describe. It looks like a complete oneness with all of creation. Since my baptism in 2011 in the Episcopal Church, I've often thought about that oneness and about what belonging to Christ means. From my observations, it seems this is expressed in terms of action, what one does, how one behaves, love others, do good works, live into charity, mercy, and forbearance. But there's a shift within as well. I feel it as a release of ego and my very essence. What Thomas describes is the feeling when I do so. When I can make this release, it puts me in the same room with the divine. How can we use nature to cultivate an awareness of God? How do we enter a space of reverence where there are no walls and no ceilings, and yet where we find a room we share with Creator Spirit? Merton had pondered this as well that first day walking in the forest. Quote, "And I thought, if we only knew how to use this space and this area of sky and these free woods," unquote. Considering his reflections on that pivotal day and then how he lived and wrote afterward, I think the answer to this cultivation question comes in 3 pieces. He began by going out every day and walking the earth in a sacred manner, meaning reverently, with his whole being open to the feel of the earth underneath him and of the air around him. Merton often walked barefoot so that he could better appreciate connecting with the ground. The second piece involved an ongoing acknowledgement of the weather. The third seemed to be about learning all he could about the rooms of his outdoor home, including the names of the flowers and trees that furnished it, and the birds and animals who resided there. The assembled wisdom of these pieces brought Merton to the unity of creation and his place in it. Quote, "How absolutely central is the truth that we are, first of all, part of nature, though we are a very special part, that which is conscious of God. In solitude, one is entirely surrounded by beings which perfectly obey God," unquote. Merton's words make me smile. It's like he recognizes a different monastery existing on the property of Gethsemane. He knew there would be much to learn there, and he was eager to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophfronia. That's beautiful. I love that in his quote when he says one is entirely surrounded by beings which perfectly obey God when you're alone in nature. Just the freedom of creatures who technically don't have free will, but instead they're free to be exactly who they were designed to be.
Yes.
So in a second, I want to helicopter out and have you tell us about how you came to know Merton and came to write the book. But while we're on the subject of nature, I wondered if we could talk about birds for just a minute. I see a lot of birds throughout this book. At the beginning, even in the very first words from Conjectures of the Guilty Bystander that you ever heard and were captivated by from Merton, he's talking about birds. And then this chapter, of course, is called I Am a Bird Waiting. And then there's a part in your chapter on prayer where you come to this after years of putting in the work to have a consistent, fervent prayer life. You have these dark moments where you find that you cannot pray, and you have this epiphany, and you see an eagle soaring, and it changes your idea about what it means to pray in those difficult times. So was the bird motif, was that something that was intentional? Or talk about birds for a minute.
It's interesting. When one writes a book, it's like sometimes a reader will say, "Oh, was this a motif?" And it's like, "Whoa, I didn't realize I'd done that." This is one of those things, Katie. No, it was not intentional. But I think when you engage with Merton, who was engaged with nature the way that he is, birds, I notice birds. I particularly like him, although I don't have an ear for noticing birdsong, I like to look at them, especially the very colorful ones. And every so often there are bluebirds around here where I live. And I always feel like that's such a magical moment because it feels like a moment of hope. So there's something about birds that, and their freedom and their mastery of the air and being able to see this world from many different points of view. I don't know. There's something masterful and magical about them, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So tell us how you first came to know Merton, if you would.
Yeah, it had to do with that passage you mentioned from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. When I was beginning my own MFA program, when I was a student, one of the first lectures, the instructor quoted this lengthy passage from Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, How the Valley Awakes. And I was especially struck not just by his mentioned description of the birds awaking in turn, but also this sense of how paradise is all around and we don't comprehend it, that the sword is taken away, that we are okay and we don't realize it. So it felt familiar and hopeful, and yet had no idea what I was hearing. It's like, oh my gosh, what is this? I've just felt lit up. It's like, oh my, just yes, that's it. Who is this Thomas Merton? How did he write those words? And where, I need to go look at these words. And so I wrote down, I'm a student, I'm taking notes, and I write down the name of the book, and I decide to look for it at my local library. I go online, and my library doesn't have it, so I have to request it via interlibrary loan. And I think it's interesting that I didn't just go out and buy the book. Maybe I couldn't afford it, but also I just, wasn't ready to take that step. But I was waiting for that book to show up. And when it did, I went straight to the library. I got the book and I'm looking through it, but I couldn't find that passage. And I thought, well, did I write something down wrong, or is this the wrong book? And I flipped, kept flipping. And then I finally noticed within the spine of the book that there were, there was a ripping in there, that I realized that the passage I was looking for had been torn out. The pages were just, somebody had torn them out. And I was like, okay, well, if these words were important to somebody else, that important, I guess, there's something here. And maybe I should take this as a sign. Maybe I should be buying this book and not just taking it from the library, that there's something here that I'm supposed to be looking at in a deeper way. And that's what I did. I got that book. I also, but I first read his autobiography, Seven Story Mountain, and I was intrigued. And there was something about him that felt familiar, but at the same time, maybe because he felt familiar to me, I felt there was something missing in that autobiography. I felt like he was equivocating, that there was something that he wasn't talking about. And I thought it was just me as a writing teacher, like just feeling like, oh, there's something you're not talking about here. So I just had that sense. It didn't really go anywhere at first. But I was in my church's library one day, shelving books, and I came upon a biography of Merton called The Seven Mountains of Thomas Merton. I believe Michael Mott is the author. And it's a huge book. And so I was just really taken with, I just sat down and started flipping through it. And I came across this important section that talks about how Merton's work was censored. And it wasn't just Merton, like anyone who wrote for the Catholic Church, their work had to go through this editing and censorship process. And he often fought with the censors. But my instinct had been right, that there were things about his life that were taken out of that book, or he was encouraged not to mention it. Things like the fact that he had fathered a child out of wedlock when he was in college. So I was intrigued by that. But I also learned in this book that Merton journaled extensively, and that in fact, his journals have been published under the stipulation that they not be published until 25 years after his death. And that's when I realized, okay, if he journaled that extensively, that's where I'm going to find the real Thomas Merton, the Thomas Merton that I had a glimpse of in this book. And so I went and got all 7 journals and lined them up on my bookshelf and started making my way through them. And it was not something I could do all at once, because his journals are thick and tiny print, and I had to take breaks from it from time to time, but I just started absorbing this material. And I would mention Merton in my social media. Sometimes I would quote him. I taught a class once about him. It's something in connection with my church. And I felt, it was just something that I did. But I didn't realize that I was becoming known, like my friend, when my friends sent me a Merton quote and said, well, there's your boy, right? I was like, what do you mean? Merton is my boy. But I realized my friends were starting to associate me with Thomas Merton. And one of them asked me to be on a panel about Thomas Merton at the Festival of Faith and Writing, which happens every other year at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I said, yes, I said, sure, I'm happy to talk about Thomas Merton. But it wasn't until I was actually there sitting on stage with my friend and another person and looking out at the audience that I realized, well, wait a minute, I have not studied Merton in the way that the other people on stage have. I'm not an academic, I'm not a theologian. And I suddenly felt kind of like an imposter. And I was like, well, I better tell people this, I better fess up. And I said right away, it's like, look, I'm not an academic, I'm not a theologian. I just kind of have this monk who follows me around and gives me advice. So that's how I'm gonna talk about Merton today. Just how I think about his writing, almost like in conversation of how he helps me think about things that I'm dealing with in my life. And I was struck by how, I guess, that resonated with people in the audience, because throughout the rest of the conference, people would come up to me to talk about it. And eventually one woman did say to me, and you're writing your Thomas Merton book, aren't you? And I was like, yes, I am. I'm going to write my Thomas Merton book. And I was saying this to earlier to someone. I said, if someone had said that to me a week earlier, like any time before that panel, I would have said, so many people have written about Thomas Merton. There are tons of Thomas Merton books out there. No one needs me to talk about Thomas Merton. But the experience of that audience and what people were talking to me about made me realize I do have something to say about Thomas Merton. Usually if people are engaging with me about a question, to me that means they don't have the answer in the way that they would like to consume it, right? So maybe I have something to offer in the way that I read Thomas Merton, and how can I craft a book around that? And so that was my intention. And maybe in the process, I can bring new people to Thomas Merton.
Sure, sure. You mentioned in the book that if you met Thomas Merton at a cocktail party, you may not like him very much.
Yeah.
And yet you talk about him and to him in the book in a very personal way, in a really very affectionate way, even though you did not even meet him until I think 43 years after he died, right?
Yeah.
So how do you account for that kind of paradoxical sort of discrepancy? And I guess, what do you think, if you had met him in real life, you could have struck up the type of friendship that you feel you have?
Yeah. I think yes, he would have annoyed me, and I probably would have told friends like, oh my gosh, there was this guy. But the fact that I had told someone about him, and I probably would have kept talking about him, and he probably, because of that energy, probably would have showed up in my life again somehow. I probably would have ended up becoming friends because um, because there, he wasn't someone who spoke out of ignorance, right? Or ego, even though he had a huge ego. He was someone who was trying to communicate. Sometimes that brashness was hiding a vulnerability. And I think when you spend more time with a person, that shell kind of, breaks, right? And you can get down to talking about the real stuff. And I feel like I've had that experience before. I think he would be like that.
Sure, sure. So Publishers Weekly describes your book as part biography and part spiritual meditation. It's kind of an amorphous kind of work. It's hard to categorize this book. How did you decide on the format for the book, or did you even decide, or did it just start to come naturally as you sat down to write?
Oh, actually, that was a suggestion from my brilliant editor, Valerie Weaver-Zerker. I knew that I had topics. I knew I wanted to talk about the topics. And I was writing, I knew I would write about them. I knew I would address Thomas Merton by name sometimes in a conversational way. But I had no idea of the order. And I even told her that. I don't know what order these should be in. I don't even know if I'm going in the right direction with this. And she pointed out two specific things. Number one, that she kept reminding me that most people don't know who Thomas Merton is, and that I would often speak about him as though people know. And in that vein came the second suggestion, that maybe we should structure the book as a biography and put the topics in the order in which he would have most likely have dealt with them in his life. And I loved that idea. It made so much sense. And I saw right away that I could do that, and that it would be a richer book for it, to be able to tell his story, even as we're looking at issues of our times, and me thinking about the things that I'm dealing with in my life, that it worked really well.
Sure. Which was there a chapter that was the most fun to write?
Oh goodness. I like, and maybe because I'm a relationships person, I like, there are two chapters in particular. I like The Soul Selects Its Society, right? Making how to make spiritual friends. And also the chapter about love, right? Swiping right in the marketplace, how to love. Because I feel as though it's something that, especially younger people, that the marketplace of love is so confusing right now, especially with online dating and all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated the fact that Merton, number one, fell in love, experienced love, if not physically. He still emotionally fell in love with one of his nurses when he was in his early 50s, but also that he felt impelled to write about it because he too understood what he was like as a young man and how he couldn't process or believe that somebody else loved him. And he felt impelled to write about it so that other people could have that benefit from his experience, right? Of and how he wrote about thinking about oneself with value, like having your own value and not expecting to go out into the marketplace and find value because someone else finds you attractive, right? So I was really, that's something that's always percolating in me about wanting to talk about that, about because love is so complex, and I loved that this gave me an avenue to talk about this with him.
Sure, sure. Were there chapters that were particularly difficult for you to write?
Oh, the race chapter, the race chapter. One of the things that my editor also would sort of tap me on the shoulder and make sure that I wasn't getting too insular, right? So that the conversation wasn't leaving people out, right? And so that chapter in particular had um, the danger of becoming insular in that way, because I was very much trying to work out my own personal issues with how to handle race matters, right? And how to do that from knowing that I'm talking about wounds from a very personal level, while at the same time helping others see their way through this issue and how to think about it for themselves.
Hmm. I was really struck in that chapter on race, which I think you call hopeful eyes on a seemingly hopeless
On a hopeless
issue.
issue, yeah.
Yeah. I was really struck by how you seem to be consciously like making the choice to turn away from resentment and approach your writing of that about that issue with compassion. And also how at the end there's a lot in our churches and in the wider culture, there's a lot of talk these days about race relations or racial reconciliation, but you zero in on another R word, which is redemption. And I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk about how what does redemption mean for you specifically when it comes to race?
Yeah, to me, redemption means that people can be forgiven, and we are all worthy of being forgiven, and that at some point we have to understand deeply that we are not operate we aren't always operating out of how shall I say, it's not like an inbred, like a baby is not born hating,
Mm,
right? So a person who is expressing hatred has been brought along on the journey of his life or her life to feel that way. So but does that make that person any less valuable? No. How can I come to understand that person's path? How can I come to view this person with compassion and to understand where they're coming from? And this is what Thomas Merton is expressing as well to a Black priest who is asking for his help, is that we have to come to understand the depth of our humanity, that we are equal, right? And the big issue with racism is that at the heart of it, there is a feeling that one race or person or whatever is better than another. And that if we don't get to the heart of that, if we can't somehow strip that away, then it's always going to be a problem. To me, redemption is about how the forgiveness has to start from somewhere. That if one person isn't holding out the forgiveness, then we are always going to be like this at
mm,
odds, and that goes nowhere. Right? We have
mm.
to be in the here and now, and look for the opportunities to see common ground, which isn't just about class or education. It's about the fact that we are all children of God. We are all beloved children of God.
Mm,
And how do we walk in that love, right?
mm,
Even when we see anger and hatred, such as we saw expressed at the Capitol on January 6th, right? How do we look at the people who perpetuated that to see that they must be hurting in a major way to behave that way?
mm.
And how do we come to understand that hurt instead of just acting out of the anger and the hatred, which only brings on more anger and hatred,
Sure.
right? So to me,
Sure.
redemption is about finding a way to stop the cycle and about holding the unity that we all have. And Thomas Merton talks a lot about that unity, right? That we somehow lose track of it. And we make it much more complicated than it is.
Mm. Thanks. If someone watching has never read, maybe even never heard of Thomas Merton and wanted to delve into his work, where do you recommend they start?
Well, I would just start with his life, right? The 7-Story Mountain.
Mm.
And know that you can meet Merton wherever you are. So there are people who prefer the earlier Merton, things like Seeds of Contemplation, where he wrote more about spirituality, the Sign of Jonas, right? Thoughts in Solitude. But then there comes a time later in his life where he is writing more about activism, right? Seeds of Destruction, Letters to a White Liberal, Passion for Peace. So it you can make this choice to say, well, where am I in my spiritual journey? What do I need to learn? And then go to the Merton that speaks to you right now. There's a wonderful book that just came out in May by a writer named John Sweeney, and I believe it's called Introduction to Thomas Merton. And it's a thin book, so it's basically the overview biography, and it is about his writing. So I think that would be a great overview to just, here's where I start.
Mm. Great, thanks. How have people responded to the book since it's come out? It's been out since the spring, right?
Yes.
How have people responded?
I've been, pleasantly surprised. Usually I don't ask about the book sales of my books, because to me it's like all I can do is write them.
Yeah.
But this one, I've been getting such interesting feedback that I found myself, I went to the publisher. I was like, look, I'm just curious, is this translating into sales? Because I'm getting some interesting feedback from people. And they said, yes, that the book is selling well. What I find interesting is that I wrote it with hopes that people could find their own spiritual experience within the book and to find their own Thomas Merton. Now that's a hope, and I can only write and think, okay, maybe this can happen. But it's been wonderful to hear from people stories of that actually happening. And that's really amazing to me, that that people feel compelled to give the book to friends, that that they want to read it again, right when it's done, or having their own sort of mystical experiences with it, which I thought was interesting. I've been telling this story. A friend emailed me about a Facebook post that he had seen. And this is, it was a Facebook post where a woman was reading my book, and she was reading it. She said this with envy, because she felt, I write about kind of, my own feelings of having experiences with God. And she was feeling like, well, why does this happen to other people, that I've never had such an experience? And she's reading the book and feeling that way. And she gets to the part about prayer. And I'm talking about Thomas Merton's icons and praying with icons and the icons I have in my own home. And she's reading the book, and she decides to take her favorite icon off her shelf and just hold it in her lap while she's reading. She keeps reading the book. And then she says, Scott, seemingly out of the blue, quotes John. And this is a verse I keep it on my desk here. John 10, I am the good shepherd, and I know mine, and mine know me, neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. And then she writes, for the rest of the story, see image. And she posted a picture of her icon, and the icon was the Good Shepherd.
Mm.
And so, and she's like hashtag like Holy Week mystery approaches or something like that. And I was like, yeah, this is what it's about. It's about knowing that we are all connected. It's
Yeah.
not just me with my special connection or you with your special connection. It is all of us. So that was just, I loved that hopeful energy that came from that message.
Sure, sure.
So,
I feel there's a lot of those types of moments, those little moments in your book. There's the story about the Chase Lounge, and the story about you're walking through New York City and you're thinking of, I never bump into this friend, and then you bump into, it's those small things like that you're just open to the sort of mystical. You're open to the God is with me. He's paying attention to me and
yeah.
working things out for my good. And even the way that you came to know Merton, I think if I had gone to a library and seen that the pages that I wanted were ripped out of the book, I would have been really angry and cynical about that. And I would have been like, well, that's, of course, like, go to the library and somebody's taken it. What a despicable thing to do. But you see that as, oh, well, maybe this is a sign that I'm supposed to dig a little deeper here. So I like that. I like that about this book and about your approach.
Yeah, it's funny that you should say that, because it's funny. It's like, wow, I guess that is unusual. That never occurred to me that I would just say, oh, well, there you go. But I did feel it was important to tell stories like the one you just mentioned about walking through New York City, because that was a moment where I was deeply grieving and was very much in a moment of despair. And I want people to know, to recognize that help shows up, right? That you've probably had moments like that and didn't realize it, right? So, and like you said, maybe next time you come up and find a book with pages torn out of it, maybe you're going to think differently about it. Maybe this is something else, because I think, as I said, the spirit is everywhere, and I think sometimes we're just not listening. And we don't realize, or we think it's serendipity. It's like, or something happens and it distracts us from the pain that we were in. Well, was that a distraction, or were you even asking for this help, and you don't even realize it showed up?
Right.
I noticed it showed up. Right.
Yeah. I love that. I know we're running out of time. I wanted to mention, if anybody out there watching has a question, feel free to drop it in the Q&A. I have several more questions. We'll see how many we have time for. But so in April 2020, you mentioned this in the book, writer and professor Gregory Hillis wrote an article for America Magazine, and he titled it, "We're All Monks Now." So I wonder, how has this pandemic season affected you as a Christian, as a contemplative thinker, and as a writer? What has it been like for you in the way that you work and in the way that you're working out your faith?
Well, it's interesting. I've been working from home for many years. So in that respect, other than not having to drive my son to school anymore, my working life really didn't change that much. I was working on this book. I'd just been hired to launch the MFA program that you mentioned at the top of our program. So I really had a lot of things that to do. The thing about faith life, and this is something I've been working out now, still working out, is what happens when church is something else, right? So I'm still working out that feeling about what it was like not going to church after going to church pretty much every week for years and years and years. So personally, I know I don't feel disconnected from spirit, but I recognize that others have felt that way. Lisa Deem, who is also a Broadleaf Books author, she and I decided to do a virtual pilgrimage. Like, we did a Lenten series over the course of 7 weeks this past spring. because we felt that there was a need for people to gather each week to check in on their spirituality, to think about the concept of pilgrimage, and to somehow journey our way back to spirit if we were away from it, or to renew it, or just to really figure out where we were in terms of spirit. And I think that was a tremendous journey just in terms of the connection. I think people just liked having a place to come and talk spirit in a different way each week. So for me, it's about thinking about what's that going to be like as our church opens up again, where I am with connecting with the people of my church. And I'm still walking that. I'm not sure what it's going to be like. I'm still doing my own personal spiritual reading, still meditating, right? Still having that connection, but trying to figure out what is where does church fit in with that connection where I am now? I don't know yet. We shall see.
Mm, sure. So you mentioned this past June, last month, was the inaugural residency of this MFA, this creative writing program that you have started up, that you're building up from the ground and directing at Alma College in Michigan. So how did it go, and what is it like to build up a program like that from the ground? And I always like to ask writers who are also teachers, how does your teaching inform your writing, and if so, how?
I have a wonderful team that I've worked with at Alma, still work with, to get this program going, marketing people, admissions people, recruiting students, recruiting the faculty. So it was like, we've spent the past year putting all these pieces together, and, it's like building an airplane or a rocket ship. It's like, okay, we put it all together. Is it going to fly? Right? Let's see. And you go, put it out there on the runway, and there it goes. And it was amazing. I'd almost forgotten, but because, I told you I work from home and I'm doing all these things, and I was so focused on the fact that this was the first residency for the program, I kind of had forgotten that this would be the first in-person event for everyone. So there was that kind of weirdness in those first, that first day or so. It's like, oh my gosh, can I hug you? And what is this going to be like? And then just kind of like a joy settling in of people just being happy to be with each other and talking about writing. And it was just tremendous. And I sat in those classrooms along with them, right? So, and the other faculty mentioned this as well. We are all writers, and we are all constantly learning. So, and we learn from each other. So it's an ongoing process, right? So teaching writing, directing writing, being a part of this will feed my writing, will continue to feed my writing, just because it is an artistic community, right? And this is, we feed each other's spirit.
Sure. Last question, what are you working on right now?
A historical fiction, and set in Civil War South, and it's about I think I mentioned this in the race chapter that I'm still working my redemption thing.
Yeah.
Working out, because I'm working with a mixed race character, and she's finding her way in the world, so looking for the expressions of her unity, right, and looking to for that expression to be there in terms of the way she works, and also in the way she loves, and how she doesn't want to hide the fact that she is, as the term is back then, mulatto, that she is half Black.
Well, best wishes with that project and with all of your writing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to everybody out there who joined us. This has been recorded, and we'll put it up on our website and our YouTube channel, so it'll live on there. So pick up a copy of The Seeker and the Monk from Midtown Reader. Thank you so much, Sophfronia. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you everyone for being here. Take care.
Have a good night.
You too.